Gilles, and I welcome you all to Compass 2022, the annual Speaker Conclave of Caucus, the discussion forum of Hindu College. Today we are going to have a panel discussion on the topic Decoding the Ballots, Road to 2024 Elections, with Dr. Gilles Verniers and Mr. Shivam Singh. This discussion will aim to focus on the run-up to the 2024 Lok Sabha elections, where the current NDA regime will be vying to win a third straight term in power, a feat that has remarkably been achieved only once before in the history of the Indian democracy by the Indian National Congress under the stewardship of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. So the recently concluded assembly elections in 5 states, they seem to indicate that the BJP and its leadership remain popular figures even after ruling for 8 years at the center. After retaining incumbent governments in 4 states, the BJP is certainly on a high. But apart from discussing the BJP's electoral gains, another important aspect that needs to be pondered upon is the shrinking opposition space in the country. The principal opposition force, the Indian National Congress, seems to be on the decline, and the struggle for survival among the regional parties can also possibly turn out to be a threatening signal for the Indian democracy. So for the discussion today, we have 2 eminent personalities here with us. Our first speaker is Dr. Gilles Verniers. He is a renowned scholar who is currently working as an assistant professor of political science at Ashoka University. He is a senior visiting fellow at CPR and the co-convener of CPR TCPT Dialogues on Indian Politics. He is working on various projects concerning Indian elections and contemporary Indian politics. Dr. Verniers specializes in political analysis and electoral studies while also working on the Indian system of democracy and in particular the rise of regional parties in India. His experience and expertise in analyzing India's political system and electoral politics will surely contribute fruitfully to the discussion and lead to an engaging conversation. Our second panelist for this discussion is Mr. Shivam Singh. He is a prominent journalist and author. Mr. Singh is a data analyst who has worked as a political consultant for major political parties in various elections. He has previously worked as a political consultant for the BJP, and he has also been associated as a consultant with IPAC. He currently runs a data consultancy and is an advisor to Our Democracy, India's biggest political crowdfunding platform. Mr. Singh is also the author of several bestsellers such as How to Win an Indian Election and The Art of Conjuring Realities. He has also appeared on various national television debates and he writes for several news outlets. Having worked closely with political stakeholders, his experience in engaging with political parties and its leaders will surely help us get a better perspective of how political parties function and the brainstorming that goes on behind the scenes while trying to win an election. Now, moving forward with the discussion, I would like to hand over the reins to our moderators for today's session, Mr. Avnendra Yadav and Siddharth Kaushik, so that we can begin this much awaited session and continue navigating towards an informed tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vijit, and welcome each and every one of you. Before we start with the session, I would like to explain the method in which the session will proceed, basically the procedure of the session. Initially, we'll start with the introductory remarks by both the panelists, followed by a 40 to 45 minutes moderated discussion in which the moderators will be having a conversation with the panelists and try to get a better picture of the topic. Eventually, in the last 10 minutes, we'll have audience question and answer, and if time permits, we'll have as many as possible, right? So I would like to welcome both the panelists once again, and I would request Dr. Verniers to go ahead with his introductory remarks first, followed by Mr. Singh.
All right, thank you very much, and thanks to the Hindu College Caucus for this very kind invitation. In 17 years in Delhi, this is the first time that I'm coming here, so I'm really happy to have that chance. And okay, so the topic of the day is the road towards 2024. And let me start by telling you what, and I'm sure Shivam you'll agree, that we don't want to do is to do an exercise of prediction. First, Shivam thinks that there's not much prediction to be made because the outcome is already known. I'm not so sure about that. But in order to spend our time a little bit productively, what are the big questions that we need to keep in mind looking ahead at what is going to happen? And so if we look at the 4 elections that just occurred, the main message, I think, is that there is a consolidation of what political scientists have called the 4th party system, right? Which is a new one dominant party system in which, of course, the BJP dominate at the national level. And so it was pretty remarkable for the BJP to win 4 elections where it was the incumbent party. We know that anti-incumbency is a factor in Indian elections. They've clearly beaten that. Uttar Pradesh is very significant, of course, because not a single serving chief minister, after having served a full term, has actually succeeded in getting re-elected in UP. You have to go back to Saponanan or to even GB Pant to have that. And in Goa and in Uttarakhand, it actually won comfortably what could have been, what should have been more competitive elections. And so this actually comes as a news for the BJP, because if you look at the picture of state elections from 2017 to 2022, the results for the BJP have been mixed. Because of course their dominance has increased at the national level in national elections, but they have been challenged more and more in state elections. They've actually still lost more state elections than they have won since 2017. But they seem to find a way to increase the momentum and reassert themselves at the state level, which of course is necessary for them to keep the momentum going on the way to 2024. And so when we look at this dominant system, this 4th party system, if you look at what are some of its main features, there are at least 4 or 5 key elements that we need to pay attention to. The first one is the growing consensus around the ideology of the dominant party. By this, I don't mean that everyone or other parties necessarily agree or adhere to the core program, the core vision, the core ideology that the BJP asserts, but they're not attacking the BJP on that, because there is this perception that there's such growing popular support for some of the key ideas the BJP stands for that it would actually backfire to attack the BJP on that. So instead, they attack the BJP on performance, on governance, on the claims they do about their achievements, but not on the cultural aspect or the ideological aspects, which do play a very important role in the consolidation of the BJP. And so that gives the BJP the ability to shape the political discourse, to shape the political terrain. It gives the BJP the ability to prepare the ground on which elections are fought. So most of you would have read the news in recent years, and there's been a lot of distressing news about the spate of communal violence that has taken place across the country. I'm quite struck by the fact that most of the incidents that have been reported have taken place in not only BJP-ruled states, but states that are going for elections next year: Karnataka, Madhya Pradesh, Himachal, Gujarat. And so the capacity of the BJP to dominate also the public sphere and the public sphere as a physical space also help it to prepare the ground on which elections are fought, and that gives it a considerable advantage. And then beyond that, there's a long list of advantages, and that Shivam describes very well in his book about what works well for the BJP. We know that they command disproportionate access to resources. We know they have a formidable organizational machine that enables them to be very effective in campaigning. they obviously have the leadership appeal, which works, of course, in their favor. And there's a list of factors that have been cited to explain how the BJP won in UP, for example. The personalization of welfare, the fact that welfare is seen as an instrument to generate electoral support is also a factor. But what we need to pay attention to also is the fact that that dominance, or that sentiment of dominance, which was very strong after the 2017 UP election, which came as a huge shock when they won 312 seats, right? That dominance also has limitations, but that these limitations are found at the state level, not at the national level, and they are found in particular configurations. So if you look at the elections that the BJP has recently lost, in Tamil Nadu, in West Bengal, in Delhi, it's when it's opposed by a party that succeeds in incarnating a collective form of identity which is different than the collective form of identity that the BJP promotes, right? It's usually grounded in regionalism, it's usually grounded in language, it's grounded in culture. In Tamil Nadu, in West Bengal, of course, it's particularly strong. But there you see that the BJP can be challenged when it is confronted by an adversary which is not just commenting on what the BJP has done right or wrong, but it's actually proposing something to voters that goes beyond the accumulation or addition of various narrow segments of the electorate. What the UP elections have told us very clearly is that these strategies of the past that consist in making these caste arithmetics on its own has become utterly insufficient to deliver victories, because you need broad transversal appeal. And in order to do that, you don't need one message, you need 6, 7, 8 messages that you can send simultaneously to voters, and people can choose the reason, to support the party. And the BJP has become very good at doing that. It has a communal face, but it also has a charitable face. It has a strong leadership face. It makes claims on law and order. It makes claims on transforming the way welfare is thought of and conceived. And so people can choose aspects that they like, and they can also choose to ignore aspects that they don't adhere to or they don't like, and then still provide their support to the BJP. And so the few parties that have succeeded in opposing the BJP, posing a real challenge, are those who also have that ability to mobilize on multiple grounds and to mobilize also people's imagination around collective identities. That being said, this is an oppositional space that is not shrinking, but it's more and more contained in particular pockets. It's striking to see that most of those states with regionalist parties tend to be peripheral states. It's the south, it's the east, it's West Bengal, but the bulk of the siege of BJP's dominance remains northern India, remains the Hindi belt, remains the 10 or so states where BJP Congress are facing one another. And the fact, and the arithmetic is brutal here, but since 2014 in general elections, whenever the BJP and Congress have opposed one another, the BJP has won in 90% of the cases. And so as long as that equation doesn't change, whatever happens with opposition unity and creating a third front platform or a third front plus Congress platform is not going to go very far, because all those regional parties that are formidable in their own states can do literally nothing to support the Congress, and they're not even willing to do that in the states where it's Congress versus BJP. I'm sure there will be questions about AAP and its expansion, so I'm not, anticipating on that. The last point that I wanted to make is a call for caution, because I'm struck by the fact that the definition of what accounts for the victory of a party is usually left to the winner himself to define, right? So the BJP explains, for instance, that this is the 5 things that they've done in this campaign, therefore this is what accounts for the victory. The reality is that things are far more complicated. We don't have enough data, we don't have enough information, we don't have predictive model that enable us to study in detail and with precision the links between governance and electoral outcome, the links between campaign effects and electoral outcome, and even the drive behind the determinants of electoral behavior is not something that we understand very well. And the temptation is to say, this is what the BJP did, or this is what Party X did, and this is the outcome, therefore everything worked. The reality is that it's far more complicated than that. And so we need to resist, simplistic, explanation. And in particular, we need to resist against the temptation to just accept the winner's version of, why they won the election, right? Because of course they have a stake in building a narrative around why they actually perform. So there's still a great deal that we actually don't know about, and which makes me think that Indian elections retain an unpredictable character, which is a very helpful thing. So I'll stop here for a minute.
The entire caucus team and Hindu College for having me over. It's excellent to be here with Dr. Verniers. It's the first time I'm meeting him in person, even though we've interacted a lot in different panels over the years. And I completely agree with absolutely everything that he said, but I'll put a couple of examples out there to illustrate how things work on the ground. So I worked on the BJP campaigns in several states that went to polls between 2016 and 2018. And BJP won the elections there for the first time. And after that, I was invited to a lot of national teams. And I had to basically talk about how the BJP won and why the BJP won. And whenever I used to come back, I used to discuss it with the entire campaign team, and the reality is you try 50 different things during an election campaign. ये कर देते हैं, उस समय जो समझ में आता है, जिस चीज़ का भी resource होता है, you end up doing all of that. Out of that, some things end up working, and some things don't work at all. After the election is done and you won is when you construct the narrative that, okay, this is what we saw, and that is why we did this, and this is what we saw, and that is why we did this. And the opinion that people have of an election is based on that story that the political party itself tells. It might not always be true. I'll quote the point that Dr. Verniers mentioned with what I think about them. See, the mic's kind of, yes, I think this one should be better. So going over like anti-incumbency as a subject for one, it's definitely a major thing, but my experience during the Uttar Pradesh campaign right now, I was discussing it with a couple of very senior BJP leaders itself, who are talking about how no one's won the state repeatedly since forever. And essentially, there wasn't a chief minister in UP who's completed 10 years since independence. But the reality is that the other states around Uttar Pradesh actually had a lot of governments who've repeated pretty often. You look at a state like Orissa, where Naveen Patnaik has been there for like over 15 years. Delhi itself, Sheila Dikshit was there for 15 years. Then Aam Aadmi Party has come in and has been here for 10 years now. You look at Madhya Pradesh, where Shivraj Singh Chauhan has been there for a while. Gujarat, Narendra Modi himself was there for a while. So in general, anti-incumbency can be beaten. When is it not beaten is when you have a nebulous, weak opposition that does not stand for much, one. Or second, when a government in power is able to create pro-incumbency. When people are not trying to vote for the least best outcome, when they're actually actively trying to vote for a particular side because they want to support that side. I believe BJP today in a lot of places in the country has reached that pro-incumbency state, where people aren't voting for the BJP because, oh, there's no one better. People are voting for it because they really accept a lot of the things that the party stands for. Coming to the second point, clearly all people don't vote based on one factor, no matter how strong it is. There will definitely be voters who vote for BJP because, oh, Hindutva, and we feel a threat from Muslim expansionism in the country, and BJP is the only party who can take care of it. There will be some people who do it based on a welfare measure, who do it based on a government scheme benefit that they've received. Some people will do it because they really, really dislike the opposition. So you cannot see the voting big as an entity and decide that, okay, this is why someone is winning. You literally have to try, when working on an election campaign, to segment people on how many people are voting based on each of these different factors. Coming to elections itself at the state level and the national level, it's more centralized than ever, which is a factor that we all have to respect at this point of time. If you think you can make a local candidate win based on local issues, it might not be the case at all, because people might be voting for Modi and national pride and keeping the nation intact. If the voting is happening along those lines, as it was in 2019 after Pulwama and Balakot, a lot of people's vote was for a strong nation and a strong national level leader. In this kind of a scenario, even if the local candidate is much better than the person in front of them, and this happened in like my own village, the MP constituency during the 2019 elections, people were like, भैया क्या करें, वोट डालने का मन तो नहीं है उनके लिए, बट मोदी जी के लिए डालना पड़ेगा. तो ये होता है, ये centralization has happened. Because of the centralization, another thing happens, which is that money resource becomes concentrated. If you look at the earlier model of politics, local candidates raised money at a local level, spent it to campaign within their own constituencies. With electoral bonds coming in, with a strong center party coming in, money now goes from huge houses directly to the central party. The local candidate does not spend nearly enough to be able to compete with that machinery, with national advertising, with television advertising, with the video vans, with the SMS and the IVRS messaging campaigns. The number of avenues, including social media and Facebook and WhatsApp, the number of avenues to deliver your message has increased, and this leads to increased cost. Because you can't leave any of the avenues open for the opposition to reach people. You literally have to flood all of them with messaging. And this happens with centralized funding, which no other party except the BJP really has in the country, nowhere close to the same extent at least. Fourth point, more than there is no alternative, Modi is a strong brand at this country, in this country at this point of time. People are voting for him is what the opposition also has to accept. As we mentioned, the first anti-incumbency point, a lot of people tell me, oh, 5वां साल का इलेक्शन तो आसान होता है, 10वें साल में देखेंगे कि 5 साल का इलेक्शन तो मनमोहन सिंह भी जीत गए थे. It's a very common adage, but the reality of the country is that some sort of pro-incumbency, due to different factors, has already set in. If you can't even accept it, then you can't fight it. If you keep, and I've seen a lot of BJP people do this, by the way. They are excellent at promoting these messages. So a lot of BJP people will tell opposition, essentially कार्यकर्ताओं that अरे 10 साल तो कौन ही रहता है, तुम्हें मेहनत की जरूरत नहीं है, तुम बैठ जाओ कि automatically हार जाएंगे 10 साल के बाद तो. And the opposition also believes it to a certain extent and stops working as hard, which is something that is clearly not going to work anymore. Centralization of power and communication machineries is a major thing. The second book that I wrote, it's based on information warfare, and the concept that we arrived at is, if you look at prehistory, human power was entirely dependent on muscle power. If a tribe had more people, if a person within a tribe was physically stronger, they'd dominate and they'd control power. The next phase went to economic power during the Industrial Revolution. So whichever country had more money, like all of, say, Belgium or the UK, the people who became colonial powers, they never had larger armies. What they had was more money. And that became a source of global power. The world right now, if you control the flow of information, that is how you stay in power. This is true at an international level between countries, but it's even true between political parties. If BJP decides what information that you see, then they are essentially going to control your thoughts, and they're going to control who you are as a human being. And we are at that stage where for a lot of people, the message that they receive is entirely controlled by BJP. Their information environment is shaped by one political party, and that they believe that information. So their version of reality will be very different from, like, say, someone sitting in Khan Market in Delhi, their version of reality. Because they're just reading different facts the entire day. Their timelines on social media, the newspapers they consume, the media they consume is entirely different. Last part, issue framing is a very important thing. Right now, I do not see anyone in the opposition framing too many of the issues. The debate on Hindutva and secularism is something that BJP framed. The debate on law and order, say in Uttar Pradesh, or on nationalism, or on India-Pakistan, all of these issues are shaped by BJP and the opposition responds. At the present moment, even if in a state like Uttar Pradesh, the opposition itself has not been able to focus the debate in any one direction. Control of media is a major part of it because they decide what they'll debate on the 9 p.m. news. But I haven't even seen a concerted plan made between opposition parties on, okay, this is the issue that we are going to debate, and these are the kind of issues where if the anchor raises it, we are going to like scold him and not engage. And it might be a decent strategy to call out the media when they raise like, say, Hindutva issues and things like that. Lastly, as Dr. Verniers mentioned, opposition unity is not as big a force as most people assume it to be. In common parlance, people are like, "Arey, unity honi chahiye, saath aa jayenge to better karenge." Reality of the matter is that most strong forces against the BJP are actually regional parties which don't have vote share in other people's states. As in, Mamata Banerjee has no votes in Tamil Nadu. DMK has no votes in West Bengal. Both of them don't have any votes in Maharashtra. So them coming together might not result in too big of a vote pooling and a vote transference towards the opposition's side. It might still be worthwhile for other reasons, but it's to be remembered that it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to fix anything. So those are my opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for your remarks. My first question is, now I think we should begin with our moderated discussion. So my first question is for Dr. Verniers. Sir, you have been studying and reading about the tyrants in Indian politics for a period of time. I would like to know your view on the transition of Indian political scenario from the one-party dominance led by Congress to the era of coalition and to, as you mentioned in your address, the rise of BJP as a dominant force.
Okay, so 75 years of political transformation, 2-minute response, right?
Yes, sir, in your brief word.
Okay. Okay, so what were the sources of, dominance of, the Congress party? If we refer back to, classic literature, Rajni Kothari, the Congress system, they had actually a series of factors that actually they could combine. The ability to adapt to terrain wherever they were creating a new BJP, a new Congress branch, right? The ability to co-opt local elites, the ability to bank on the status and the capacity of local elites to deliver votes. That combined with the ability to create social coalition that ensured them not a majority of the votes, but a vote share large enough to win, most of the elections. It's the coalition of extreme, and so you had sort of a mixture of everything you needed, right? You had elitist political recruitment. You had a social coalition in place that ensured mobilization and the votes. You had charismatic leadership in the figure of Prime Minister Nehru, and you had a strong pyramidal organization which sort of created a parallel to the state, where state and Congress became almost synonymous. What happened is that over time, the social groups which were not included in that Congress system, essentially agrarian, peasant caste, OBCs, started mobilizing on their own. They started throwing their support behind opposition parties who had been there from the very beginning, but who also shared with the Congress party that sort of elitist upper caste background that it had. And so the rise of the opposition was initially very, very slow, because the opposition space was fragmented, because they themselves were pretty elitist, because none of them actually provided substantive representation to Dalits or OBCs, or none of them claimed to provide representations to minorities either, right? They were trying to fight the Congress on its own terrain, and they would always fail, because the Congress has this great capacity of absorbing political competition. the only competition that made sense was not against the Congress, but within the Congress, right? And that made the Congress extremely powerful for decades. But then that model crumbled. And this is a really long history, you know, in a nutshell. But economic, social transformation, policy interventions in the 50s, such as the Zamindari Abolition Act, reshuffled the cards of power at a local level, helped communities that were not represented in politics to generate resources, generate some surplus, which they could invest into political mobilization, and they did that gradually. They also started to realize that in order to challenge the Congress, you needed to reduce opposition fragmentation. And that's why you had all those coalition experiments taking place, first at the state level, from the 1960s onwards. 1967, you have 7 or 8 coalition governments, you know, defeat taking place of the Congress. You have the SVD with Charan Singh in UP and so forth. And then that formula evolves up to the end of the emergency. But what happens after that is a phase of new fragmentation of the political space. The Janta experiment, for all its successes, also failed to retain any kind of cohesiveness because it did not have much cohesion in the first place, and so gave way to a fragmentation, a new fragmentation of the opposition space. First on state lines, right? Janta party branches claiming their autonomy in Bihar, in Karnataka, in UP, in Haryana, and then within those states, those branches also split, but on caste lines, because that's how the competition took place within those branches. And that's the beginning of the birth of many of the regional parties that are still known, Samajwadi Party, and the RJD in Bihar, who are sort of inheritors of that socialist tradition, right? And so you come to a situation where no party can govern on their own, no party can win a single majority. Coalition governments in India have been far more frequent than we know, that we seem to remember. And then the configuration of coalition changes. In the early 90s, you have this third front attempt at creating alternatives to both the Congress and the BJP. None of them, all of them actually were short-lived, or none of them had sufficient number, none of them had sufficient internal cohesiveness to actually resist to internal squabbling and so forth. And you had a succession. This is when I arrived first in India in the late 90s. It was for people like us, this was a golden age because you had general elections every year. That was fantastic. For the country, not so much, but for political scientists, that was pretty good. And then you have a stabilization of that system with the emergence of NDA first and then UPA second, where you have a reorganization of the political space. 2014 comes, the BJP wins a majority and does away with all those power-sharing mechanisms that had been experimented upon over so many decades in the states where that it governs and at the national level. And we are today indeed in a phase of political concentration of power that finds no precedence in India back to the period of the emergency, back to Indira Gandhi brand of dominance, if you will, even though those two periods, of course, have important differences. And so the question really that we can ask is, do the political process, do the transformation that we see push towards more concentration and therefore a reduction of the other function of the other functions of democracy, or does it push us towards a model where you have different power centers attending to different aspects of making a democracy work, like an independent judiciary, like a functioning parliament, like a fairly independent media. And it seems to me that the phase that we live in is a phase of growing concentration of political power, which is backed by the most extraordinary period of concentration of economic wealth that we've ever seen in India. In the recent issue of the magazine Seminar, my colleague Nilanjan Sarkar has a very interesting essay on the conjunction between those two phenomena, showing how 2 years ago, 20 individuals cornered 67% of corporate profits in India, which backs actually Shivam's point that you no longer to have a diffuse model of party funding. You can just go to these 20 individuals, and that basically covers most of your needs. And so the concentration of power, both political and economic, is really a marker of the period in which we live.
Thank you, sir. You talked about how we are living in a period of power consolidation at the center, right? So I want to bring the role of opposition over here. Both of you talked about the downtrend that has been going on for the past 10 years, right? So they seem to take one step forward and 2 steps backward, right? The opposition that we have today. Do you think that in the past 10 years, the downtrend in the opposition can be solely dedicated to this rise of BJP and their control over the center, as well as now we can see in the state governments? Or do we also need to bring into play the sort of fallacies of the opposition parties and the breaking down of opposition coalitions and everything? So yeah, I would like Mr. Singh to answer first, followed by Dr. Verniers.
Yep, so just to clarify, not a doctor and not a journalist. But yes, other than that, yeah. So there are a couple of really interesting things happening with the opposition itself. One of the key things is that they do not have a centralized message mechanism anymore. If you were to ask what does the opposition stand for, it stands for, we will not do Hindutva politics, we will not create religious divide. It stands for, we will not suppress people, we will not take over institutions like the judiciary and the media and this and that, we will not crush people's freedoms. But ultimately it's all about what they would not do. There is very little about what they would do. So ultimately the opposition also needs a message on vote for us because of this. This played out in Uttar Pradesh to a very large extent, where you saw that Samajwadi Party and RLD together did get all of, say, the Muslim and Yadav vote, but they were not able to add any other community to it. They added some Rajbhar votes and Jat voters in 3 districts in Western Uttar Pradesh. But other than that, no major community shifted allegiances, and they never provided any reason for anyone else to shift. If this was a 3-party contest where Mayawati was contesting like she was in, say, 10 years ago, then Samajwadi Party probably would have won in a 3-cornered contest. But when it is 2-cornered, it's only them with 2 caste groups and the BJP with everyone else based on different messages on why every community should vote for them. This model will fail. So that is where the opposition is right now. The second component is that the opposition does require a message delivery mechanism, which they do not have, because they obviously do not have as many TV channels as the BJP has direct control over now. They do not have as many social media channels. They don't have money to boost so many different pages. And investigations by the Reporters Collective came out about how the Facebook algorithm itself promotes BJP by providing them a cheaper ad rate in different ways. How they did not block a lot of the party affiliated pages which are not official BJP pages. So all of these things are there. Opposition has to figure out the message delivery mechanism. Tech companies do have some role in it, and I believe the opposition should be going after them too, because say WhatsApp changed its policy in 2018. Now you can't create WhatsApp groups at the same extent. Ek zamane mein, when this entire thing initially started out, you could literally just take lists of phone numbers, segregate people based on whatever community, whatever region, and add them to WhatsApp groups. And you could keep doing this the entire day. You could automate the process. Now you do it and you create 2 groups, your SIM card is going to get blocked. So no longer is the bulk creation of WhatsApp group a technical possibility. There are ways to do it, but it can't be done at the same scale, is what I'm saying. But the groups that the BJP made pre this change in policy in 2018, those groups are still alive. It's not like WhatsApp deleted all the groups in 2018 and said, "Achha, level playing field, ab naye bana lo jo bana sako." So wo groups abhi bhi hain. Because of a structure like that, the competition is very unfair. The playing field is very unlevel. How the opposition counters it is something that they should be having public discussions over. And I don't have a solution for it. Like neither for the media, neither for the concentration of wealth, neither for like the tech platform on BJP's reach. But it is something that they will have to address.
So the two things that strike me about the opposition space today is how little space they actually take between elections. So I was actually quite pleased when I read that Akhilesh Yadav decided to resign from the Lok Sabha to take the Vidal Sabha seat to be the leader of the opposition in UP. That's very nice, but he should have done that 5 years ago. And so the problem with the opposition is that it tends to be relatively dormant between election and sort of wakes up a few months ahead of an election when the party in power has already battered the ground for already for quite a few months, and where the game is largely, not entirely, but largely played already. There is a difference in drive. There is a difference in a sheer will, if you will. It's very striking that the day where the Prime Minister gave his speech on the victory in the fourth state election, the next day, and this was of course pointedly advertised, he spent 2 days addressing Karyakatas in BJP in Gujarat, right? Already setting in motion the wheels of the next election, literally the day after. And this is not, and you don't see, the opposition matching that kind of drive, right? And that not only helps the BJP organizationally, but it helps also to create an impression that they want this much more than the others. And the second point is that opposition unity has to be something more than the sum of its parts. If the game of creating opposition unity is to go on a black or white board and just make, addition of projected vote share, this is never going to work, right? Because they need to build a narrative, not only that can counter the BJP narrative, but that can also explain to voters why a power sharing configuration is actually a more effective idea or a better idea than the kind of power concentration that we have. But that requires imagination, and there are brilliant figures among the opposition, but you don't see those ideas emerge as yet, and if they emerge, they're likely to emerge very late in the process.
Thank you, sir, for your answer. Moving on to our next question. I believe when we are talking about the opposition, it is imperative for us to discuss about the largest opposition party, which also happens to be the oldest party in India, the Indian National Congress. Why do you think that the Indian National Congress has lost its prominence in recent times? And when I say recent times, it doesn't only mean about the national politics, but also in states and regions where it had its own ascendancy. For example, to name a few, the state of Assam or the state of Punjab, Kerala, where it's struggling to come back to power. I would like to ask Dr. Verniers to answer this, followed by Mr. Singh.
Okay, so actually it's not a recent phenomenon. The decline of the Congress is something that can be traced back actually to several decades. The decline first was organizational. The party split on several occasions from the 50s to the 90s. They had these big vertical splits at the center, and they also had state branches that split to create new parties. In a way, if you put together all the parties that have emerged from the Congress party, the Congress brand of politics is doing very well in India, but not within the Congress party anymore. It's the the BJD, it's the Trinamool Congress, and so forth. And so if you look at the performance of the BJP over time, it's literally a descending staircase over several decades, right? So this has been long in the making. So it's been an incremental decline, which is now accelerating because we've reached a point where voters are no longer to wait for what is going to be the next experiment that the Congress will do to try to revive itself in Uttar Pradesh, right? Or elsewhere for that matter. And also we see alternative emerging in places where there was no alternative to either Congress or BJP. And AAP definitely is going in the coming months and years try to occupy more of that space. But there are other factors also which I could call factor of erosion, which show that the Congress party is actually eroding from the base, right? It's eroding from the ground. So many of its cadres, so many of its party workers are shifting to other parties. So many of its MLAs and MPs are shifting to other parties. The few remaining figures that the Congress had in UP shifted to other parties ahead of the election. In Goa, 25% of the BJP candidates actually came from Congress. The same thing happened in Manipur. The Congress no longer offers any incentives for ambitious politicians to actually stay. If you want a political career, which party gives you a better chance, right? And my sense is that this erosion is going to continue. And so we can look at current factors. Obviously, it does not help to have a vacancy, at the top. They have an unappointed or unelected, unofficial leaders. That brings a message. It's confusing. It's not obviously helping. But look at the trend, right? The descending staircase, which shows you that it's a long process. The last point on this is that this is something that we've seen in other countries, parties that have been in power sometimes for 50 years, and which all of a sudden collapsed. Some of them have actually revived themselves or came back in Mexico, in Japan, in Germany, but the way they've done that was by transforming themselves almost wholesale. New ideas, new leadership, new...
Second model that parties of that, their cadres and karyakartas get some amount of empowerment. They have the same, say, government policies being implemented in their local areas, government schemes being delivered. They have some power in the local thana where people listen to them so that they can get some local works done. That is why a person becomes a karyakarta. जो झंडा लेके घूम रहा है उसका एक purpose है कि झंडा लेके क्यों घूम रहा है. Congress, as of right now, people aren't very hopeful that it will come back to power. So that part is gone. The cadre preservation needed to happen through an ideological base. You needed to tell people why do you have to stay in the Congress, why is it your responsibility to support the Congress, and essentially guilt trip them into it, which is something that the Congress hasn't done very well. So people shift wholesale. Where BJP entered states where it did not have a base at all, like in the Northeast, it took over the Congress party. And that is how it started emerging. If you look at Aam Aadmi Party, that's essentially what they do too. In Delhi, they took over the Congress base first, and after that, took over the entire thing. Punjab, similar story. They're right now planning to go to Gujarat. They might appropriate a lot of the Congress votes because the Congress voter is essentially looking for who can they support. They do want to support in the opposition, so they'll support anyone who presents to be a viable alternative. The second component of Congress's decline, I actually believe, is that the leadership became too distant from the ground. Even right now, if you look at the Congress Working Committee, there are very few people within the leadership who have votes. So there are regional leaders within states who run the Congress party on their own with not much to do with the central party command. And then there are people in the Central Working Committee who are essentially like people who might be excellent, who might be very smart, might be excellent for India, but they do not have a vote base and they do not have a mass appeal. And ultimately, to counter a force like BJP, which is entirely based on mass appeal and mass mobilization, you do need mass leaders. So you need an organization general secretary who speaks very good Hindi, who can go give speeches in North India. Abhi like Congress में अच्छा हिंदी में भाषण कौन देगा सोचना पड़ता है. That shouldn't be a scenario. This needs to change and restructure for the opposition to be a thing.
Thank you, sir. I would like to bring the discussion a little more towards looking at the 2024 elections, right? So over here, I would like to bring in the question of UP. Recently, we saw that BJP once again dominated the state election in Uttar Pradesh. And as we know, it is stated that the UP elections are sort of the semi-finals for the general elections, right? How much truth does this statement hold in today's time? And can we see the BJP's victory in UP as sort of a writing on the wall for the 2024 election, that once again we will see BJP in power?
So there are two aspects to that question. The first is that you cannot look at one regional election, however important it is, and use that as a predictor for what's going to happen 2 years down the line. Because if you do the stats on the predictability of state election with the following general election, actually the results go into every direction. Remember 2018, the Congress, actually it was a very good year for the Congress because they won surprisingly in Rajasthan, in Madhya Pradesh, and in Chhattisgarh. And they won in the most, they had the highest vote share in the rural seats where you had the largest share of farmers voters. And there was already, a discourse, a narrative on crisis of agriculture. And so a lot of people thought, that's it. Farmers mobilization, this is going to be the undoing, of the BJP in the next, general election. And literally 6 months later, not only does the BJP win all those states, completely sweep 90% of the seats, but it does its best seats that actually brought other parties to power in the election before. And so the rule at the moment, and it's been like this for a while, is that you have a decoupling of electoral behavior between state and general election. In the sense that people who vote for Yogi Adityanath in this election may decide to vote differently in 2024. And so you cannot really use one election to derive, predictability. On the other hand, it does to the party winning that election because just like in 2017, massive victory in UP helped to forge an image of invincibility, which translates into reality if you look at the number of elections that the BJP lost after that. But still the memory victory stayed on and necessarily helped the BJP.
Yeah, I completely agreed with that. Too soon to predict 2024 for a lot of reasons. Also because economic front is something that has affected a lot of elections in the past. We don't know what's going to be the situation. If price rise continues, if unemployment continues, if things keep going wrong, sometimes the voter does not even care who's in the opposition. If you look at an election like 2004, the voter did not essentially care who is in front of Vajpayee. It was essentially कि भाई प्याज का दाम इतना है, India Shining campaign चल रही है, shining करता हुआ तो कुछ दिख नहीं रहा है, we are going to put you out. And they voted for whoever was the next in line in the opposition. It wasn't effectively a campaign by the opposition at all. So something like that is always a possibility. It seems unlikely at this point of time, but you never know. And UP itself, definitely the fight between Yogi Adityanath's image and Akhilesh Yadav's image and local Gundagardi, that were definitely key issues that had a huge influence on this election, which are not factors in national voting at all.
Also remember that there are different kinds of opposition. There's a political opposition, parties, regional congress, but there's also a social opposition which comes from social movements. And as most people who seek change lose faith in party politics and elections, will be more inclined to engage into other kinds of collective action in the form of social movement, which is what we've seen with the farmers' movement. They deliberately stayed away from political parties. They did not seek the endorsement or the support from opposition parties. They were just not interested in that. And for various reasons, political parties were not interested, opposition parties or the Congress in Punjab were not interested to provide much support to the farmers' movement in the first place. And as economic disparities increase, as economic distress increase, as youth unemployment increases, the temptation to take up to the street rather than to the ballot to express discontent, as we saw ahead of the UP election with those job riots in eastern UP and in Bihar, this is something that to my mind is going to intensify on the road to 2024.
Thank you very much for that answer. That was indeed a great answer from both our panelists. Coming on to the final question of this moderated session, I would like to ask our esteemed panelists about who do we think should be considered as the front-runner challengers of the BJP. There have been several political entities who have come up with alliances to stop the victorious failure of the BJP in the past. For example, the Grand Alliance of 2019, where two regional giants in Uttar Pradesh came up together but failed. Is it the Aam Aadmi Party or the Trinamool Congress or a Federal Front or any other political entity?
Yeah, that's honestly an impossible question to answer at this point of time. One thing I'm pretty sure of, without the revival of Congress, there is no National Front in 2024. It will not happen. Everyone else could come together. I don't think it will make much of a difference because no one has a pan-India cadre and no one has a pan-India voter base other than the Congress party at this point of time. What is effective about them is that even though the party is like down and out, it still has offices in all the districts of the country. It still has a lot of sub-district level offices. It does have office bearers at these stages. That setup is something that even the regional partners can utilize, and that is something that propels you to like national interest anyways. The second component of it is even if all the other regional parties come together, BJP will continue to focus on the Congress. You will notice this in Gujarat. It's going to be very surprising, but Aam Aadmi Party is going to run an excellent campaign in Gujarat. A lot of people are going to talk about how Aam Aadmi Party is going to do extremely well, except the BJP will stay completely focused on the Congress party. They will keep talking about Rahul Gandhi, they will keep talking about Congress failure, which is something that they will continue to do in 2024 also. Just because in people's mind the debate has to be framed as a BJP versus Congress fight for the maximum benefit for them. Just because of this scenario, without Congress revival, very difficult. Aam Aadmi Party though, like expanding in multiple states, taking away Congress vote share, might be a force in like say 2029 or beyond, but not in 2024.
So to complete, Shivam's answer, at the moment there is no front runner in the making, right? One would be hard pressed to find who might be the person. But I think it's a wrong idea to try to look for that person, because what can oppose the BJP is not just an individual, but it has to be an idea or a set of ideas. And a way of explaining how a power sharing configuration might be more suited to protect fundamental rights and liberties and civic rights in India, and also to reconnect also with the spirit of federalism, respecting states' rights, and having an approach to politics that recognizes its complexity and recognizes the necessity to negotiate. The problem is that that brand of politics, which is loosely known as coalition politics, has been tainted by the corruption of the UPA 1 and 2, by the wrongdoings of individual ministers and cadres and parties, and is still associated with all forms of politics. So it's an exercise of imagination to reinvent a way of retying a link with an idea of political pluralism. But it's difficult to do that when the climate, and this is not just India but everywhere else, favors the emergence of strongman politics, of personalization and concentration of power. And so the choice the opposition has to make is, do you try to find an alternative figure to the Prime Minister, which is an uphill task, or do you propose another way of doing politics that connects more with the spirit of the Constitution, the ideas of pluralism, and so on. But who can do that? Who can have that imagination? I don't have an answer to that question.
Right, sir. So it all boils down to the first statement you made in your introductory remarks, that there's a building consensus of the ideology of the dominant party. Right. So with this, we come to an end to this moderated discussion, and now it's time for the audience question and answer session. We would, so anyone willing to ask a question from our panelists, please raise our hand. Right, sir, right.
ऑडियंस के पास
Thank you very much, sir, for this one.
हेलो
Thank you very much for this fascinating session. First of all, my question is whether the Hindutva versus Hinduism debate, which has been around the buzz in the national media as well, can the opposition really forge a narrative around that? Following that up, there's a question on the rise of the Aam Aadmi Party as a national alternative. I doubt it really, because see, the Congress's vote share around the country is 12 crore voters, which is highly formidable. And to my mind, creating a Congress-led opposition without the Congress in opposition is really empty, because the Congress represents a national space. Thank you, sir.
Professor Verniers said that it's not just about the ideology, it's also about the BJP being a very well-oiled machine and always being on the clock with their work, which the Congress has lacked in the last few years. And because of that, there's been a wider chasm that's opened up into what's being fed to the voter base, because the BJP is always on the clock with their campaigning. So that chasm, that gap, do you think it will grow in the future? Or do you think Congress can claw something back? Thank you.
could you just give it over here because you've been waiting for it.
This is Darpin from BGP College, Political Science. Just one question I wanted to ask was that if there is an attack like Pulwama or something, let's not talk about who did that. But if there is an attack before this 2024, will you still think that the BJP will win and will take it? And the second question is just a brief one that what is
aggressiveness and public hatred, because that's what it is. Look at, just the images, what happened in Jahangirpuri, what happened in Karbon, what happened, in Karnataka, and the growing involvement of people who seem to be younger and younger as well. We see minors, we see children actually in those, demonstration, people chanting. And so one of the thoughts that occurred to me is, isn't there anyone to, decry what is happening to Hindu festivals like, Ram Navami? I don't have a memory that it used to be an opportunity for the expression of that kind of hatred and violence. And so you could make, an opposition party could make an argument that this is not just about Hindu-Muslim relations, but it's also about the debasing or the degrading of forms of practice of Hinduism that were never meant to be associated or to be used or instrumentalized as a platform for violence or even for politics in its simpler form. But we know from surveys, and there was a YouGov CPR survey not long ago that shows that there is a growing adhesion for the mixing of religion and politics in India that cuts across party bases. In fact, to the question, should politics and religion be mixed, not only was there a majority opinion to answer yes to that question, that it's fine to do that, but the responses among Congress supporters were as strong as among BJP supporters, right? And this also tells you that parties come and go, parties rise and then they decline. But they decline, they rise and they decline on the back of deeper transformation that is happening in society. You have economic change, you have transformation of religious practice, you have social change, you have growing disparities, inequalities. And this is also what shapes. Parties respond, they adapt themselves to these circumstances. And as Shivam said, they keep trying, experimenting what will work here, what will work there. This doesn't seem to work, let's try it elsewhere. And that's how you see those tactics being deployed, across the territory. But you don't see but the reason why the opposition is so shy to take on those questions is because they know, they've read the same survey, that there is actually a growing popular support not necessarily for violence or hatred, I don't think so, but for the mixing of registers, for the mixing of politics and religion, and that might explain why they refrain from actually, reacting on this. On the rise of ARP nationally, I mean, that's very much a work in progress. ARP is still a recent party. I do believe that the victory in Punjab is also the product of extraordinary circumstances. The ARP has benefited, of course they've done a good campaign, but they have benefited from a widespread rejection of Punjab's political class as a whole. Not just Congress, but also Shiromani Akali. All the historical political figures, all the senior leaders have been decimated and have lost their seats, including Prakash Singh Badal, who knew he could lose his seat, right? And so these were kind of extraordinary circumstances that created a void and an empty space that ARP could fill. And they did that through smart campaigning and undoubtedly. But when they find themselves, in other states like Gujarat, they find, political parties that are actually much more established. And of course, the BJP has been in power for more than 20 years, and the Congress is behind. But the Congress is still a 40% party in Gujarat, and it still has strong local implementation. So they will have to identify which pocket can be, which pockets can be penetrated, where can we, grab, votes where there is more discontent against Congress. But it's going to be seat by seat, pocket by pocket, which means that it's going to be a very gradual process. Don't forget that, I understand why we get excited with ARP, but don't forget that at a national level, it's a what, 1% party, right? And so the road from 1% to 15% to 20% to 30%, it's a very, very long road.
Completely agreed with that. Starting with the well-oiled machine. BJP is definitely an extremely well-oiled machine, and they work very hard on elections. Like if you look at Delhi elections, all of Delhi BJP knew that they're not winning Delhi. They still tried everything that they could. They campaigned, they took on Shaheen Bagh, ye Musliman ko support kar raha hai, ye wo sab, matlab, they do not stop at anything to actually win elections. And this is true for even municipal elections. You see the entire cabinet descend upon a state to handle, like say, a small municipal election in a state like Karnataka, or the municipal elections that were going to happen in Delhi right now that have been indefinitely postponed. So you see the national leadership of the party getting involved in every election, which is something that, like, obviously no other party does to the same extent. But the fact is that the oil machine was created. It was created by the money that came into the BJP, by the political wisdom that Prime Minister Narendra Modi brought to it, by the Hindutva messaging that came in. It's all of that at play because the parties existed for a long time. It did not get created in 2014. So where was the well-oiled machine between, say, 2004 and 2014? They did lose 2004, they did lose 2009. So the machinery is entirely dependent on the leadership trying to create it. So it can be done for the opposition if you find a person to do it. Pulwama type attack before 2024, what effect that would have? Completely dependent on how it's framed. And framing, as of right now, the opposition does not have a message dissemination mechanism to frame a narrative around anything that happens. To be able to do that, they need to create those, just the ability to send the messages. So we did this thing before 2019 elections where we did some tracking of videos essentially, and the BJP videos were 23 times as many people saw BJP videos as compared to Congress videos. So when the numbers are that diluted, for normal social media posts on official accounts, not even counting unofficial, it was a 6:1 ratio. So 6 times more people saw BJP messaging because they have bigger pages at the state level. National pages still compare. National leaders, Twitter following and stuff like that still compares. But you look at the state pages. You look at BJP Bihar, BJP Jharkhand versus Congress Bihar, Congress Jharkhand, Congress Uttar Pradesh. Those numbers are so different that they just have no ability to frame the messaging. And PK being a BJP agent. So here's the reality of the matter. No one's a BJP agent. Everyone is an agent for themselves. In politics, to a large extent, people have their own motivations. People have their own reasons for doing things. a lot of people say कि अच्छा ओवैसी B team में BJP की. Even if he is getting to take vote share from some states and helping BJP, he is growing his own party at the end of it. Aam Aadmi Party at a lot of places gets called BJP's B team, but they are ultimately growing their own political party. So Prashant Kishore is ultimately a political entity. He's been very clear about this since the very beginning that okay, he does campaigns, he does run a company that helps with political consultancy, but he wants to be in politics. So ultimately that does involve him doing things for his own best interest. That right now lies with the opposition. There is no space for BJP in BJP for Prashant Kishore. He will. It's clearly been demonstrated since 2014 that wasn't able to fit in there, hasn't been able to fit in into a lot of political parties, hasn't made the transition from consultant to an active politician. So the space for that is in the opposition. So he will stay this side. Interesting part, he is the person in touch with the most number of opposition leaders around the country. So he does have an important role.
Something else to ask. But my dear fellow's question made a lot of sense in that. And I felt that even our esteemed panelists, no offense intended, kind of shied away from addressing and bequeathing the gravity that this question deserved. You see, on 27 February 2002, Sabarmati Express burnt down. 17 December 2002, a certain party came back to rule. On 14 February, 40 Indian soldiers got blown away and a certain person got back to rule. And to put it more explicitly and with this question deserves, क्या भारत देश की राजनीति अपने इस हाशिए पर पहुंच गई है कि चंद राष्ट्रीय घटनाओं को नियोजित करके उसे जब चाहे आराम से नियंत्रित किया जा सकता है? I think Mr. Singh will be the right person to answer this. Thank you.
So, भारत की राजनीति और हर देश की राजनीति हमेशा यहाँ रही है. जब ट्विन टावर्स गिरे थे तो उस पर भी कोई पावर पे वापस आया था. तो दुनिया की सच्चाई ये है कि ऐसी घटनाएं जो होती हैं उससे पॉलिटिक्स पे बहुत बड़ा प्रभाव पड़ता है, बहुत बड़ा असर पड़ता है. अगर आप चाहते हैं एज एन ऑपोजिशन कि ऐसा कुछ हो और उसका एक पॉलिटिकल व्यक्ति को फायदा ना मिले, पॉलिटिकल पार्टी को फायदा ना मिले, तो ये बात आपको जनता तक पहुंचानी पड़ेगी, ये बात आपको जनता को समझानी पड़ेगी. आप ये बात कैसे समझा सकते हैं? इसके लिए आपको एक मीडिया पे कंट्रोल चाहिए, एक मैसेज डिलीवरी मैकेनिज्म चाहिए. इज व्हाट आई वाज ट्राइंग टू गेट एट. वेरी डिफिकल्ट टू से कि अच्छा भारत की राजनीति यहाँ पे आ चुकी है, तो मतलब इसका तो यही मतलब है कि सब हताश हो जाए, निराश हो जाए कि 2024 से पहले कुछ अचानक से होगा जो कि आपके कंट्रोल में नहीं है. It is a very big possibility, and it is always a possibility कि some big spectacle will happen before a major elections. Riots have happened before elections in a lot of different Indian states. They have led to polarization. Dr. Verniers mentioned the Ram Navami situations and riots that are happening. They are all happening in states going to polls. No Ram Navami riot happened in Uttar Pradesh, which is one of the more polarized states in the country, but nothing happened during Ram Navami protests. So things like this do have a political motivation at a lot of times. What I would say is still it is the responsibility of the opposition party to be able to frame that messaging better, to make it non-effective. Because as of right now, it is effective. Things like this do help win elections. So इसका क्या कर सकते हैं?
Yeah, we won't be able to take any more questions, and once again I would like to thank both the panelists, and I would request our host Vinny to take over from here.
So with this we have come to the discussion, and I'd like to thank our panelists for having such an engaging and enlightening discussion with us. And now I'd like to invite third year students from our society, Meghna and Chahat, to present our token of appreciation on behalf of caucus to our esteemed panelists. Thanks so much everyone for sitting patiently through the event and listening to the discussion.